In June of 1947, William Brazel discovered strange debris strewn across his ranch on the outskirts of Roswell, New Mexico. Unaware of its origins, William eventually decided to gather up the debris and take it to the sheriff's office in town. His strange but seemingly innocuous findings would eventually make headline news and go on to become one of the most infamous and hotly debated stories. From crash-landed flying saucers to alien corpses and government cover-ups, today we dig a little deeper into the Roswell incident. The national obsession with UFOs and flying saucers is often considered to have begun on June 24, 1947, with a man by the name of Kenneth Arnold. Kenneth was an amateur pilot from Idaho and was flying his small Call Air A-2 plane to an air show in Oregon. Along the way, Kenneth decided to do some exploring around Mount Rainier in Washington state. A Marine Corps C-46 transport plane had recently gone down in the area, and there was a $5,000 cash reward for the finder of the wreckage. While exploring, Kenneth said that he saw a bright flash of bluish light off in the distance. He described it as seeing sunlight reflected off of a mirror at just the right angle. He searched the skies for its source, but found nothing. Then more lights flashed brightly in quick succession, 9 separate lights. Kenneth noticed that these lights appeared to be vehicles of some sort, and that they were flying in an echelon formation, spread across a total distance of about 5 miles, according to his estimation. The vehicles flew in perfect formation, sometimes banking or flipping, but always in unison. He went through all the possibilities in his head, trying to explain away what he was seeing, but after ruling them all out, he was left to assume that perhaps they were experimental government craft. He watched the craft as they moved and decided to attempt to document their speed. He knew that Mount Rainier and Mount Adams were approximately 50 miles apart, and he calculated that it took the craft 1 minute and 42 seconds to cover that distance. This put the estimated speed at around 1,700 miles per hour, significantly faster than any known aircraft at the time. When Kenneth later landed in Yakima, Washington to refuel, he told his story to some of the airport staff, who were friends of his. Kenneth made his way onward to Pendleton, Oregon, but word spread quickly. A Pendleton newspaper called the East Oregonian caught wind of his account and sat down with Kenneth to interview him about the events he witnessed. Kenneth would be interviewed many times going forward about his story, including by government officials and military officials. On the screen now is a document written by Kenneth Arnold. It also shows his drawing of what he saw with some description of the object. The term flying saucer was coined based on Kenneth's description of the flying objects. However, he claims that his words were misquoted. He clarified his statements in a 1950 interview with Ed Murrow, where he explained that he had said the object moved like a boat through rough waters, or as a saucer would when skipped across the water. Kenneth's drawing also seems to indicate that the object was not actually saucer-shaped. At this point, however, the term flying saucer had grabbed national attention, and there was no going back. A few weeks prior to Kenneth Arnold's encounter in early June of 1947, William Brazel was discovering strange debris scattered across his ranch outside of Roswell, New Mexico. He was unsure what to make of the findings, and was planning to gather up the debris and dispose of it. On July 5th, 1947, William had yet to dispose of the debris, but had put it out of his mind as he made the trip to Corona, New Mexico. Kenneth Arnold's encounter was all over the news by this point, but as William did not have a phone or radio on his ranch, he was completely unaware of the strange sightings. While in town, William heard about the silvery flying saucers and immediately thought back to the strange debris he had found on his property. He made his way back home and decided to gather up some of the debris and take it to the local sheriff's office in Roswell. The sheriff contacted the Roswell Army Airfield, who passed the assignment to Major Jesse Marcel. Jesse then walked the property with William, gathered up some pieces of debris, and took them home on the night of July 7, 1947. The following morning, Major Marcel handed the debris over to his commander, Colonel William Blanchard, who then reported the findings to General Roger Ramey. General Ramey ordered that the material be flown to the Fort Worth Army Airfield. Later that day, the public information officer at the Roswell Army Airfield, Walter Hott, issued the following public statement about the findings. He said, "The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office of Chaves County. The flying object landed on a ranch near Roswell sometime last week. Not having phone facilities, the rancher stored the disc until such time as he was able to contact the sheriff's office, who in turn notified Major Jesse A. Marcel of the 509th Bomb Group Intelligence Office. Action was immediately taken, and the disc was picked up at the rancher's home. It was inspected at the Roswell Army Airfield and subsequently loaned by Major Marcel to higher headquarters. On July 9, 1947, both General Ramsey and his Chief of Staff, Colonel Thomas Dubois, identified the materials in their possession as pieces of a weather balloon kite. Quickly thereafter, the Army released a revised statement explaining that what they had found were pieces of tinfoil, rubber, paper, and sticks, and specifying that no saucer-like objects had been found in the Roswell debris. The public was consoled by the officially reported findings, and the story quickly died down. The Roswell incident faded away and would not make its return for more than 30 years. In 1978, UFO researcher Stanton Friedman interviewed Major Jesse Marcel some 31 years after he had helped gather up the debris from the Brazel ranch near Roswell. Marcel's statements in the interview contradicted his initial statements to the press in 1947. In 1979, his comments were showcased in a documentary entitled UFOs Are Real that was co-written by Friedman. The documentary was eventually syndicated, and coverage by the National Enquirer triggered mass interest in the revised Marcel story. Marcel gave several additional interviews throughout the early to mid-80s that made their way onto TV shows. In one interview, Marcel explains that he was meant to keep his mouth shut about the original findings on the Roswell ranch, and that General Ramsey told the newspapers that it was nothing more than a weather balloon and to forget about it. Marcel explains that he and General Ramsey both knew this to not be the case at the time. In these interviews, Marcel also made some specific claims about some of the materials uncovered that day on the ranch. He explains that an extremely thin piece of metal was found in the wreckage that resembled the foil lining in a pack of cigarettes. The piece of metal supposedly could not be bent, and the metal seemed to easily absorb and deflect the swing of a sledgehammer. Additionally, there were numerous symbols that the Major referred to as hieroglyphics all over the paper-thin metal pieces. In all of his interviews, Marcel also maintained that there were no bodies found, or at least that he had never seen any evidence of alien bodies recovered at the crash site, but also that the materials he found that day were definitely not of this planet. These interviews also showcased the stories of additional first or second-hand accounts that claimed something alien had crash-landed in the New Mexico desert in 1947. One of these accounts was of a New Mexico engineer by the name of Barney Barnett, who claimed a flying saucer crashed just outside of Socorro, New Mexico, in early July of 1947. His accounts were featured in a 1980 book entitled The Roswell Incident. He said he and a group of archaeologists who were with him came across a large flying saucer-type object that had crashed in the desert, and that a group of military personnel came along and swore everyone to secrecy, before removing the crashed craft along with multiple alien bodies. With the dates coinciding so well with the Roswell crash and the proximity of the two cities, some speculated that the debris found on the ranch in Roswell was from the crashed alien craft supposedly recovered in Socorro. Through these documentaries, interviews, and TV shows, a government program by the name of Project Blue Book was brought to light. The documents in Project Blue Book seemed to contain some government confirmation of specific UFO encounters that had been deemed authentic. Upon reviewing the documents fully, many UFO researchers noticed that specific suspected UFO encounters that had been highly documented with numerous credible eyewitnesses were not discussed in Project Blue Book. In some government correspondence documentation released in 1979, a high-level military official claimed that UFO encounters that potentially posed a national security threat were not listed in the Project Blue Book report that had been made available to the public. This information is used by many to claim further validity for their opposition to the official government stance on UFOs. Skeptics and critics propose that Major Jesse Marcel's interviews during the late 70s and early 80s were the ramblings of an old man who had lost his grip on reality, or perhaps someone who had forgotten or misremembered details of the original account, seeing as how it had been over 30 years since he spoke of the events. As for the plethora of eyewitness accounts and claims made by people such as Barney Barnett about saucer-like crafts in the desert and dead alien bodies, critics often write these accounts off as people either seeking fame or mistelling stories they had heard, as some of the accounts were secondhand. Additionally, critics point to a hoaxed alien crash landing in Aztec, New Mexico as a source of inspiration for many of the eyewitness accounts they deemed false. The Aztec crash landing of 1950 shares some similar details to the Roswell story recounted by people such as Barney Barnett or Major Marcel. And while the late 1970s and early 1980s sparked a renewed interest in the Roswell events, the public appetite for more information would only grow. More theories would arise, and along with them, more eyewitness testimony. In 1991, Kevin Randle and Donald Schmitt published a book titled UFO Crash at Roswell. In it, they added additional testimony from over 100 new witnesses. Some of the witnesses claimed that they had seen an elaborate military cleanup operation at the Roswell Ranch crash site. Others claimed that they saw a massive gouge at the ranch that was 400 to 500 feet long, as if a craft had crashed there at high speeds, leaving a trench behind. There were even rumblings of Senator Davis Chavez allegedly ordering the local press to remain quiet about the Roswell events, as well as rancher William Brazel being gifted a new truck in exchange for his cooperation. Randle and Schmitt also reported that General Arthur Exon had been aware of the strange debris and the alien bodies found at the ranch. However, the general later came out and said that his accounts were from secondhand knowledge and that he hadn't actually seen the debris or bodies himself. The UFO crash at Roswell also featured the stories of a mortician named Glenn Dennis. Glenn had seen some secondhand claims made about the Barney Barnett story and the supposed alien bodies on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. He later called the show's hotline and claimed to have additional knowledge of the events. He said he received several calls from the airbase about preserving bodies and questions about small caskets. He also explained that he had been in contact with a local nurse who told him she had been a witness to an alien autopsy. Glenn Dennis was later caught mixing up his stories. He confused events and names and lost much of his credibility to both skeptics and UFO researchers. The biggest of these was him lying about the nurse he had been in contact with. Kevin Randle even later deemed Glenn Dennis as one of the least credible sources in his UFO Crash at Roswell book. However, Glenn later explained that he changed the name of the nurse in his official account because he promised to leave her out of the situation. Adding even more confusion to an already messy situation, other witnesses came forward and corroborated Glenn's accounts and said that Glenn had told them about his experiences shortly after they had happened and long before Roswell had made headlines. Oddly enough, the same year Kevin Randle and Donald Schmitt published their book, retired Brigadier General Thomas Dubois, who had posed with the debris for the press in 1947, came out in support of Major Marcel's statements from interviews in the late 70s and early 80s. He admitted that the official weather balloon story put forward by the military in 1947 was a cover. Stanton Friedman, UFO researcher and the man who had interviewed Major Marcel in the late 70s, released Crash at Corona in 1992. The book introduced even more potential witnesses and claimed that there were 2 flying saucers that crashed outside of Corona, New Mexico, as well as 8 alien bodies that had been recovered from the crash. 2 of the aliens were said to still be alive and had been taken into custody by the government. There were also discussions about the Majestic 12 government project. MJ-12 was alleged to be a secret committee of government officials, scientists, and military leaders formed by executive order of President Harry S. Truman in 1947 to oversee the recovery and investigation of alien craft. The document you are seeing now is a piece of supposedly classified communication referencing the MJ-12, which, along with additional witness testimony, sparked the MJ-12 theories. As with every theory in the UFO space, there was pushback regarding the validity of the papers and the credibility of the witnesses. The FBI even came out with an official statement claiming that the documents were clear forgeries and that the information contained in them was false. 2 years after that, in 1994, Randle and Schmitt authored another novel named The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell. This stated that the alien bodies that were recovered from the crash site had later been transported by cargo plane for a viewing by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. It also contained stories about government suppression of information and a variety of witness accounts discussing how they and their families were threatened with imprisonment and even death if they discussed the Roswell events. There are even claims that many new technologies showing up in military-grade equipment over the years were reverse engineered from the Roswell craft. With so many claims and variations of the story, many were at a loss as to what to believe. Even UFO researchers heavily invested in the field were unsure of how to sort out the range of accounts and variations to the stories. With public scrutiny at an all-time high, the Air Force decided to conduct an internal investigation. The first report, released in 1994, concluded that the debris recovered in 1947 was likely from Project Mogul. Project Mogul was a classified military surveillance program that utilized high-altitude balloons to detect sound waves generated by Soviet atomic bomb tests. A second report was released some 3 years later, in 1997, and claimed that all of the reports regarding recovered alien bodies were likely people who had witnessed anthropomorphic dummies being recovered by the military from their skydive testing program labeled Operation High Dive that occurred in the 1950s, combined with memories of accidents that had occurred that involved military casualties in the area. The report also credited hoaxes that were being perpetrated by various unreliable sources for many of the unsubstantiated claims. In 1995, a video of a supposed alien autopsy was released by a videographer from London named Ray Santilli. The footage exploded across news channels and made international headlines. The film was black and white and around 17 minutes long and premiered to massive ratings. In 2006, Santilli admitted that the film was a recreation. Essentially, he explained that he had utilized constructed dummy alien bodies and animal parts for brains and intestines. However, Santilli maintains that while most of the film is a reenactment, some of the frames are from original footage of an actual alien autopsy. These original frames were said to have been taken from 22 separate rolls of film, with about 4 minutes of footage per roll that Santilli had viewed in 1992. However, he claims that by the time he had the funds to purchase the film, most of the footage had been destroyed and was unusable due to exposure to heat and humidity, and that he took the final surviving frames and used them in the film while reenacting the rest. 2 years later, in 1997, former Lieutenant Colonel Philip J. Corso released his autobiographical book entitled The Day After Roswell, and purported that the Roswell crash did happen. He was assigned to Fort Riley in Kansas in July of 1947, and claimed that a sergeant had shown him non-human bodies that were from an air crash. Corso also stated that he was tasked with overseeing a project to reverse engineer the recovered crash debris. His book also made mention of MJ-12 and how the covert government group was formed under the leadership of Roscoe H. Hillenkotter, who was the first director of the CIA. Corso also talked about how the Strategic Defense Initiative program, codenamed Star Wars, had been developed not only to disable electronic guidance systems in incoming enemy warheads, but also to disable enemy or alien spacecraft. These statements lent more credence to some of the claims made earlier in the 90s by authors Kevin Randle and Donald Schmitt. In 2007, another controversial document was brought to light. Donald Schmitt and Tom Carey released their book Witness to Roswell, which showcased a document said to be a sworn affidavit by Walter Haut. Walter Haut was the military official who wrote the initial Army press release about the 1947 Roswell crash. In this document, there was a description of discussions between high-level military personnel about the crash debris, and also a recounting of how Haut had seen alien bodies. Many people questioned the validity of the document, saying that by the year 2000, Haut struggled to recall basic details about his past, making the detailed accounts in the document suspect. Later, in 2011, an American journalist, Annie Jacobson, released her book, Area 51, An Uncensored History of America's Top Secret Military Base. Her book's major theory revolved around Joseph Mengele, who was a German SS officer and a doctor in Auschwitz, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. According to Jacobson, Stalin recruited Mengele to build child-sized aviators that could be remotely piloted and landed in America to brew panic and hysteria. The idea was supposedly inspired by Orson Welles' The War of the Worlds, released in 1938. Annie Jacobson believed that the small alien bodies were actually those of children who had been tasked with flying these small craft, and an unknown accident led multiple of them to crash in the New Mexico desert. The Roswell crash landing continues to baffle UFO researchers and enthusiasts, as well as intrigue the public at large. What actually happened on the Foster Ranch in June of 1947? Were alien craft or bodies actually recovered? What about the strange materials claimed to have been found in the wreckage that had otherworldly properties? Which version of the story is true? Or perhaps none of them are true? Strange accounts from high-ranking military officials combined with the government's own findings during an internal investigation seem to verify that the official story released to the public about what happened at Roswell in June of 1947 was a cover story. But a cover for what? Comment below and let us know what you think. Also, feel free to let us know what other content you would like to see us cover on the channel. Thanks for watching. If you like our content and want to see more, be sure to subscribe and make sure to click the bell and turn on notifications so you can be alerted anytime we post new content. Also, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you would like to help our channel grow, spread the word and share our videos. I'm your host, Patrick, and we'll see you next time on The Stranger Side.